Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my soundbite. It's a pleasure to be doing this for a second year in the row for LLC. My name is Lady Steele, attorney Lady Steele on FetLife. I am the only open out practicing kinky attorney in the state of Georgia, and I am licensed in the state of Georgia. And 95% of my clients come from the either BDSM world or the non-monogamy world or the LGBT community. And I'm here to talk today about FOSTA and SESTA. One disclaimer that I have to give before I continue is that nothing that I say here is to be construed as legal advice. You watching this or somehow communicating with me as a result of it does not establish an attorney-client relationship, and nothing that is said would be confidential. So please do not say that you watch this and now I'm your attorney, because that's not exactly how that works. But if you want to contact me, please reach out at any point in time and I'll be more than glad to speak to you about whatever concerns that you have, including this very important topic. FOSTA and SESTA actually stands for something, and I wanted to get that out there. FOSTA is Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, and they were actually put SESTA before FOSTA, and the entire acronym stands for Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act and allow states and victims to fight online sex trafficking. So there's a lot of legislative history and a lot of legislative intent that came as a result, or that actually came before this and resulted in FOSTA and SESTA being passed. And so what I would like to do today is explain a little bit about the acts, how they came about, and what the effects have been on the LGBT community, the BDSM communities, and perhaps some other communities that we're all concerned with. But before we talk about FOSTA and SESTA, we need to go back in time a little bit. We're going to go back 20 years to 1996. And in 1996, the Communications Decency Act was passed, whereupon Section 230 is federal law, and Section 230 provided that, and this is a quote, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Now that's some fancy talk, but I will tell you what it means. What that means is that if you have a web page, you know, FetLife, for instance, is a really good example for this. The website themselves are not responsible for anything except what they publish as FetLife. So on my attorney Lady Steele profile, if I put on there that I like wearing polka dot blouses while being spanked, I don't know. Sometimes that can happen, you never know. But they are not responsible for the content that I write. They would only become responsible for that content if they were to change it and publish it, or change it and make it their own and say that they were actually writing this themselves. So that has been in law since 1996. And shortly thereafter, for those of you who are old enough to remember, that's whenever the internet exploded. And it covered a lot of what was going on there while still not quelling free speech. And that's what the argument is with FOSTA and SESTA, is that it is quelling free speech and has had other unintended or possibly intended, depending on who you speak to, consequences as a result. And so on April 11th, 2018, the president signed into law FOSTA and SESTA. And I decided to butcher the law a little bit because there was a very long law that the act consisted of a lot of language, and I'm going to try to condense it down so that everybody can understand it. And so in part, what FOSTA and SESTA stated was the purposes was to amend Section 230, and 230 of the Community Decency Act, whatever we just talked about, to amend Section 230 to clarify that the act itself does not prohibit the enforcement against providers and users of interactive computer services of laws related to sexual exploitation and of children and for sex trafficking. So that sounds pretty good, right? We want to make sure that sex trafficking isn't occurring. We want to make sure that children are not being exploited and trafficked for sex. And so That was the written legislative intent. There has been a rather large debate, especially in our community, in regards to whether or not these laws were passed for the purposes of quelling sex workers. So pornography producers, prostitution, which of course is illegal in most states, as well as internet content providers like webcam people, clips for sale, places like that. And now that has absolutely happened in some areas, and there's been several other effects. Now again, the intent was to keep websites from promoting the trafficking of children primarily. So what has actually happened as a result, though, and these were, I did a lot of research before I decided to do this TED Talk, because this is something that is very cutting edge, and even in, it was passed in April of 2018, there has been a lot of effects that have come as a result in the very short year that it's been in law. And there's also been a lot of speculation in regards to what it's done. As far as, I can quote some people. Assistant Attorney General Stephen Boyd from the Department of Justice said that it's going to make it harder to convict sex traffickers, because essentially what it's going to do is that it is going to drive them to the deep web, or the dark web, and the deep dark web even. And it is going to take sex workers who have legitimate, in regards to age, sex working. I'm by no means promoting any sort of illegal activity, but for the people who were using Backpage for the purposes of prostitution or other such things that were of legal age and that were doing it freely with their own consent, it has made it to where they're having to go back to the days of working the streets. And there's a lot of danger that go along with that. You know, if you watch the series, what's it called, The Deuce on HBO, you can see a lot of that. And there's a lot of historical accuracy to that. And that you had the pimps that were taking a lion's share of the money that the women were making and making it into their own, and not letting the women have any, you know, any of the money that they actually earned. And then you have, of course, just street work in general allows a lot of violence, a lot of, you know, back alley killings, people, women being, or men being picked up in regard, whenever they were being picked up for sex work and then not coming back because they were kidnapped and they were killed or were, and maimed and beat up and all of that. So that is something that is a real reality that could come back. Massage parlors, where people again are exploited, the sex workers are exploited for the money that they earn but they don't get to keep. And so that's whenever you get into literal and non-consensual slavery, and people owning people, people being used like material goods to be thrown away and to be as disposable as the people who control them want to treat them. Something else that has occurred as a result of this is that it does not encourage web pages like Backpage and Craigslist to self-police. There is a case right now, and it was this case that was in Boston that sort of fed into the FOSTA and SESTA argument that, oh, this is something that we need, is Backpage and the founders have been accused of changing the actual content on the website that people were submitting and making it, and not making it their own, not saying that they were the one posting it, but they were changing the content that somebody wrote, and therefore, whenever they published it, that means that Section 230 should have actually applied. But they're saying if Backpage was doing this, how do we know that other websites aren't doing this? And so we need to take further measures in order to take care of the people that are being trafficked. And let me give you an example, so we're not talking in the ether and in a vacuum. There were words that Backpage allegedly, again, this has not been proven yet, that they took out of ads that were being posted. Words like teenage, like rape, like the word young. So what the Jane Doe 1, 2, and 3 are accusing Backpage of is removing that language and then posting the ads, and thereby promoting the sex trafficking of minors by protecting them by taking this language out. And so that is, that's why FOSTA and SESTA sort of got the political foothold that it did, because they're saying, look, if they're doing it, then who's to say that someone else isn't doing it? And who's to say that they weren't doing this all along in the interest of protecting the, in the interest of protecting the people that were actually putting out the ads in the first place that were the pimps and that were the people that were trafficking the youth. And Backpage, however, and a lot of law enforcement agencies have said that Backpage actually did cooperate with law enforcement before, and that's why, of course, Backpage is saying, of course, they didn't do this. There's no way they would have done this. They weren't going to alter the content. And several law enforcement agencies actually did say that Backpage cooperated with sex trafficking law enforcement officers and sting operations and all of this. So if these websites are no longer allowed to publish this sort of content, then that entire resource of them being able to help the police with finding the sex traffickers are now gone. And so that's a very chilling effect, especially considering there are more than likely more pages, at least on the internet, that we all are familiar with that helped before, as opposed to now they can't help because they can't turn over any content that shows where anyone was actually, trafficking. So if they suspected it was happening, they can't turn it over to law enforcement now because it doesn't exist, because now the web pages have been taken down. And so that is very, very unfortunate. The ACLU actually wrote a letter to Congress whenever they were considering this law. And I'd like to take a quote from that particular letter, the American Civil Liberties Union. And they said, quote, "The bill would significantly chill the explosion of online political, artistic, and commercial speech without improving the plight of sex trafficking victims." And that, to me, on a First Amendment level, speaks volumes, because it has always been a concern of people, especially in our community, that the internet would always be a place where we could express ideas, where we can express our sexuality and what it is that we're doing, and our political points of view, and with language like what, if anyone can come in from the government and say, oh, you're helping in sex trafficking because of this post, or maybe you're writing about a fantasy on FetLife or something to that effect, and then just snatch the entire site, that is far broad and overreaching censorship that I don't think anybody wants, except for maybe the alt-right, who actually were the ones who put this into law in the first place. So the overreaching censorship is scary, because I think we have all seen in our lifetimes what can happen whenever people are told to basically shut up and sit down. And that's exactly what's happening here, unless, well, you're of a certain gender mix in your marriage and you're, doing it in the bed with the lights off and everything else. So for all of the rest of us, which is pretty much everyone else out here, that's a very chilling effect, because if you're shutting us up, you're shutting us down. And the other and the last aspect that I'd like to talk about, and this is the part that's really scary, especially considering the progress that has been made over the last couple of decades in the LGBT world. Because, you hear a lot about how sex workers have been affected by this and how they can no longer do their work, and they now have to be forced back into the brothels and the massage parlors and the streets. But there's an entire aspect that hasn't had a loud enough voice whenever it comes to FOSTA and SESTA, and that's the LGBT world. And I'm actually doing a discussion about this at the Atlanta Eagle next week, and they are being slowly erased with the effects of this, because sites such as different websites and apps such as Recon, Naked Boys Reading, and AMP have reported of having their Facebook pages that have absolutely nothing to do with what it is they're posting on their websites, by the way, shut down because they were reported to Facebook as having a website that violated the FOSTA and SESTA standards, and so they're having their Facebook shut down. Another site another user had their YouTube page shut down, which had absolutely nothing to do with the other website that they had. And there's been some outrage on Twitter as a result of this. Unfortunately, that has gotten a little bit of a result for them. But there are a lot of gay and lesbian dating apps and a lot of gay and lesbian sites that are being shut down because they say, oh, well, this content doesn't suit our purposes, and it's possible prostitution, it's possibly sex trafficking, and, of course, since they're gay, they must be doing it to children, right? Because that's always been the argument. Then we're going to shut them down. And then their website gets shut down, and then people who go after them with their torches and their pitchforks will go and they will report them to Facebook, and they will report them to Twitter. Fortunately, Twitter doesn't care. And we all know what happened with Tumblr. Tumblr removed all adult content. That was a huge place for LGBT youth, especially to get sex education. And I mean, yes, there was porn there. There was absolutely porn there. There's no denying that. But there has been a great deal of websites, especially LGBT websites, that have been taken down as a result of this, that were there just for sex education. And so just because they don't have sex the way that the lawmakers have sex, now they're being censored and now they're being quelled, they're being erased. And if our queer youth doesn't have a place to go to get their education, because God knows they're probably not going to get it in the schools, then what's going to happen then? What's going to happen then, at least in my personal opinion, is that disease is going to proliferate. People are not going to know what to do in regards to their sexuality. Murders will go up because, well, it's perfectly acceptable to erase the LGBT community. I've personally seen that in my life. Then their suicide rates are going to go up. People are going to start self-harming, self-loathing, and we're going to go back to the caveman times, or cave person times as it should be, as a result of this. And so, in closing, since I have 2 minutes left, I want you all to know, there was a question in BDSM in the law class that I just did about this. This came up in there. What can I do? And unfortunately right now, because this is law, you can call your legislatures. You can absolutely talk to your local and state politicians on that level. So if there is an amendment or somehow they're going to rescind the law, absolutely encourage them to do that. And I always urge people to do this. Pay attention to who your judges are. Pay attention to the ones, especially in the state Supreme Courts, because they're the ones, because the Electronic Frontiers Foundation already launched a case to oppose FOSTA and SESTA as overly broad and therefore not constitutional. Well, they were shut down, but they also have an appeal that's pending. And so it is the judges that are going to be deciding these cases, and there will ultimately be the ones that will get these acts changed or even rescinded. You know, it's difficult, especially in a highly political environment, to get the politicians to, you know, they have a lot of agendas, to get the politicians to go back and to remove these acts or to rescind these acts. And that can absolutely happen. I mean, you see it all the time in different laws. First you had DOMA, and then you had the rescission of DOMA, and then marriage equality. And while I don't deny that can actually happen, the quickest way to get any sort of result in order to get this act changed or rescinded is through the court system. And so if you want to bring a lawsuit, bring a lawsuit. But in the absence of that, if you don't have any standing or any grounds, or you don't know anyone who does, watch who it is that you vote for in regards to your judges, because they're the ones that are going to make the laws that could ultimately end up in the Supreme Court, where the constitutional aspects and qualities of this act could be analyzed, and then as a result could either be changed if they're ruled unconstitutional, or even kicked out altogether. So that's my soundbite for today. Thank you.